Good morning, everybody. This is Joe from the MiddleGround Mike. Congress once again has hit the reset button, created more crisis. They're shutting down everything out of, to me, petty, last minute deals. But what if it's not chaos? It's design. Today we're going to expose how the budget process is rigged, how you're given the illusion of choice, and how Project 2029 fits into the bigger picture of protecting the powerful law along with other special interests on both sides of the aisle. If you want a full dossier, charts, links, deep dive analysis, as we expand this stuff, sign up now for the newsletter at the middlegroundmike.com/newsletter, free loaded with source packs. And you'll get a lot of stuff you may not see on the show because obviously it'll have a graph. So you may not be able to see that on the podcast. Lisa, thanks for coming on today. Our last show the other day came out really, really good, and I loved it, and I'm thrilled to have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me back, Joe. I really enjoyed our last conversation. I think this one is going to give people a lot to chew on and kind of think over. And so, yeah, it's my pleasure to be back.
Yeah, let's start definitely with the government shutdown. But I don't know if you follow any some of the stuff that pops up on my YouTube or my other stuff. But I had talked to a big sticking point that they love to use is the subsidies for illegals. So the first part of that for me is, and then I'll put it over to you, is they're talking a lot about we need subsidies, but I'm looking at it like, why aren't we working on reforming the system that is making us need subsidies to begin with? Why aren't we returning some of this to state? And that's where I'm at. And then the second part, and you'd be able to elaborate in this being a lawyer, is if everyone was so concerned about that part of it and they wanted to make sure the states couldn't distribute it to illegals, it would take them a whopping 5 minutes to slip that in there. They've got an army of people.
All right. Yeah. So, if you don't mind, I want to talk a little bit about the congressional budget process and how it's supposed to work and how it's gotten us to where we are, to where we're like every year saying, are we shutting down or are we staying open? In 1974, Congress passed a framework for the way the budget process is supposed to work, and it was called the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. And the way it's supposed to work is in February, the first Monday in February, if possible, the president is supposed to send over his budget proposal request saying, this is what I'd like to see in the budget. And included in that is just top line numbers for every program, but also any changes that the president might like to see in some of our programs, and especially what is known as mandatory spending, which I will talk about in just a second, what exactly that means. So once that gets sent over, then Congress is supposed to pass its own concurrent budget resolution, which is a little bit different than most congressional bills because the president doesn't have to sign it. It's just a framework for Congress in how they're going to move forward with their budget. And it's supposed to be a concurrent one, meaning the House and the Senate agree. Sometimes they don't agree and they pass their own budget resolutions. And within that is supposed to be what are appropriation caps, meaning in total, what are we going to spend? And that's known as a 302A and then a 30B allocation. And this is named after the section of the Budget Act. There are 12 appropriations committees in the House and 12 in the Senate. And each of them they get their own cap. This is the total amount that you can spend for all the programs in your jurisdiction. And I want to talk a little bit about, just quickly, there is a difference between authorizing legislation and appropriations. So authorizing legislation is when we think of a law that creates a program, that's authorizing legislation. It creates the program rules and how the program works and who might be eligible for a program and those kind of things. And within those authorizing legislation, those are different committees. Those are what we would call substantive authorizing committees. They usually provide an authorization of appropriations, and that means that then the Congress has to come back and appropriate those funds each year. And this is the annual appropriations process. Sometimes that authorization of appropriation has no end date. Sometimes it's supposed to sunset, although it often doesn't, and they just keep funding it even though it's no longer authorized, but that's an entirely different topic. So in theory, what would happen is you get these 12 different appropriation bills that go through committee where they're debated and they're amended, and then that appropriations bill is passed in the House. and then it gets passed in the Senate, and they may have some differences, and then they conference those differences and pass them, and the president should sign them. And this should happen with 12 different bills, and it should happen prior to September 30th. In the 45 years that this bill or this law has been in place, we have only seen, let me just make sure I get this right, 3 times that it's actually worked that way. And so sometimes what we see is there will be some of the appropriations bills passed and conferenced, and then the president signs them. And then we have to do something different with a few of them, which you might call a minibus bill. And then other times, none of them have passed, which is the situation we find ourselves in now. And then you'll get an omnibus bill, which wraps everything up together and you pass it. And it's this huge bill with all of these different provisions. Well, one of the things that happened is that, and what we have right now that the House has passed and the Senate will not pass, is something called a continuing resolution. And those are short term, often bills that fund the government, usually just at the level they were funded the previous fiscal year, just so that the lights stay on and the programs stay open, giving Congress time to work out the differences that they have. So that's what, and the House passed what we would call a clean continuing resolution, meaning it's just saying, keep the lights on so we can work out these differences. One of
Yes.
the other unique things that can happen in a budget resolution is that they can contain something known as reconciliation instructions. And what those are is they are instructions to the authorizing committees to make changes to the mandatory programs within their jurisdiction. And in the Senate, where substantive legislation requires 60 votes due to Senate rules, and we can talk to avoid a filibuster, right? You might have heard of this before. That's why it's not just a clean majority right now. We have more than 51 votes to pass that clean continuing resolution in the Senate, but you need 60 because of the filibuster. And that's in the Senate rules, not in the Constitution. So, and the filibuster is designed to prevent a slim majority from moving our country too far at once. Okay. But if there is a budget resolution passed and there are reconciliation instructions, those changes only require 51 votes. Okay. And the reason I bring this up is because of the fact that the big, beautiful bill, which made some changes to Medicaid eligibility, was in fact a bill passed with 51 votes using reconciliation process. And what the Democrats want to do is to undo some of the changes that happened in the big, beautiful bill around Medicaid eligibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I think it's also important to understand what mandatory spending versus discretionary spending is. Okay. A mandatory spending is a spending in which the law provides both the authorization and the appropriation, meaning it says if we're going to create a program, Medicare or Social Security are two big examples of mandatory spending. If someone is eligible for benefits, it is appropriated to spend the money to provide those benefits. So that spending is not even included in the annual appropriation process. It's already been appropriated by the mandatory nature of the authorization. So currently 61% of our spending is mandatory and only
Yes.
26% is discretionary. And that's what we're fighting over in this shutdown is this 26%. And mandatory spending, 21% of that is Social Security, 13% is Medicare, 11% is Medicaid. And then you have the other things like federal retirees, pensions, and things like that are mandatory spending. And the total discretionary spending is only 1.6 trillion out of our, I believe, roughly $6 trillion budget. Okay. So that's what we're fighting over right now. The Medicaid, so there's a couple of different issues in why the Democrats are refusing to pass a clean continuing resolution in order to fund the government while they work out the differences. The first is Medicaid eligibility for illegals. And there's, I think, a lot of disinformation about what people saying different things about whether that is actually legal. And the answer is there's truth on both sides of that, Joe. I went and looked at the provision, and what is at issue is that prior to the passage of the big beautiful bill, if someone so it to be eligible for Medicaid, you could either be a citizen or an eligible alien, meaning that you are here legally and you have certain statuses, so you can get Medicaid benefits. There used to be a rule that basically, if your citizenship could not be determined at the time of your application, that you would get benefits until for a reasonable period to determine whether the person was eligible as a citizen or an eligible alien. And the big beautiful bill took that away. There's no it used to be required that you provide Medicaid. So you can see that would inevitably mean that people who were not eligible as illegal aliens were getting funding under Medicaid. What the big beautiful bill did was say, not only are you no longer required to, you can if you want to, but you can't use federal funds to pay for that. That has to be all state money. One of the things the Democrats are saying we want to fix that before we will pass a continuing resolution. The other thing is a separate issue about enhanced subsidies for healthcare insurance under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And that's an entirely different issue, which we could get into, but there's be a lot to unpack. But I think one of the important things is getting back to what you said is, prior to the Affordable Care Act, health insurance was a state issue
Yes.
because of the 10th Amendment, which was part of the Bill of Rights, which basically said if the federal government does not specifically get granted a power in the Constitution, then it belongs to the states. So essentially, states had very different rules, and there were a lot of really bad health insurance policies that I think, were particularly damaging, like lifetime limits on coverage and something called rescission, which basically they'd cancel your policy just simply because you got sick, which seems completely antithetical to what insurance is supposed to do. But it took, again, you and I talked about this a little before we started recording, but it kind of took all of those different state policies and said, if you want any federal funding, you have to basically all do this. And it did not actually make things more affordable for most people. And it took away some options that some people were really happy with. Some people had to give up their doctors. And we have just seen like a proliferation and explosion in insurance costs, whether that be premiums, whether that be deductibles, whether that be co-insurance, and it's become really unaffordable for people. And part of that is, again, in a country our size, where you have really different healthcare infrastructures and healthcare needs, it might not make sense to have a national policy that applies equally to everyone. And again, Michigan might be able to do a much better job meeting the healthcare needs of its citizens based on its own economic situation, its own healthcare infrastructure, its own uh, health situation for its residents, if it were allowed to set its own rules again. So, and the other thing is, I think we talked about this maybe a little bit in the first show, getting at the source of why are we, why do we spend so much money per person on healthcare and have such terrible results in this country? And I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again efforts and looking at our food sources, looking at the over medicalization of children and all of those things, the over, prescriptions of children may be part of how to address that. And looking at how do we keep people healthy rather than spending an enormous amount of money to treat them once they're sick, maybe a good start at that. And then also returning power to the states might be a good part of that as well.
No, yeah, and it's especially when we talk about the appropriation, not appropriations, like the CR, the continuing resolutions. And who before I kind of really dive into some of the stuff that I've kind of really dived into, I should say, I'm going to throw this out there, and you'll probably never hear me say something like this very often. I really come to admire John Fetterman. Don't agree with everything on him, but In terms of almost, and this is both sides, Republican and Democrat, in terms of who's probably the most pro-American, common sense individual standing in that Senate, if he's not number one, he's definitely got me in the top five because he's like, hey, we can have differences, we can try to work on this, but we got to make sure things that people need to function are still functioning while we fix it. And I'm like, common sense, right? And he's willing to say it no matter the consequence to him. And I'm like, that, especially in this day and age of politics, to me, that is like, I've developed a little bit of an admiration for him. If that man runs for president, it'd be very hard for me not to support him, even if he runs as a Democrat, just because, I don't agree with everything that he does, but where I can get behind politicians, even if I don't always necessarily agree with them, is where I feel their heart is at. And I feel like his heart is with the people.
And I agree with you on that, Joe. I think I have been surprised in a positive way for his willingness to sort of buck his party while still maintaining allegiance to the party. He said he's going to stay a Democrat, and I can understand that. Although, as we talked about before, I think on the first one, I think the parties are too strong, and we need to be thinking about how we can fix that in order to fix
Yes.
our division and fix our system. I would have to say I'd have to really look into what he says about free speech, because this is my cornerstone issue right now. If someone does not protect free speech, all of our rights are at risk. And so I'd have to see what he
Yes.
says. But I do like, the fact that he's speaking some truth to the power within his own party, and he's willing to risk his own political situation in order to try to make things better for the American people. And I will say, another place where, I'm sure a lot of people really hate her, but I've seen some really common sense discussion is from Marjorie Taylor Greene on healthcare. She's like,
My
where's my
God.
party's plan? Where's my party's plan to fix this? And I'd be willing to work across the aisle to get something done about this.
What I loved is she's MAGA, but she's not afraid to challenge the president. And I'm like, and just like Charlie Kirk said, that is our job essentially to challenge everything. And we're a diverse group. And I'm like, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, for a while, it kind of seemed like she just towed the line and did. But I don't know what happened in, I don't know if it was last year or whatever, but she has really been like, she's really come into her own and become her own person. And I used to kind of be like, some of the stuff she would say, I'd be like, I like her. But and now I'm kind of like going, okay, she's making some common sense now. She's not just touting the screaming talking points to try to get her point across. She's actually coming with substance, and I'm like, she could really bring some of the MAGA people a little bit more towards the center to get some things done because of there's a lot of MAGA who don't like her now, to be fair. I guess it's just the substance, is that she's presenting it and she's trying to be a little bit more balanced, especially with healthcare, right? Because she doesn't advocate necessarily a socialized system, but she's like, hey, I've heard her say things about, state level, which I'm for at the state level. If a state wants to come up with some kind of solution like that, if that's what the state wants, that's the state's choice. And if you have a state that can't afford it, right? Like they do it, but there's like shortfalls because of whatever, like an industry collapses. So, the tax revenue comes out from underneath them suddenly. To me, and I know that that's not popular among conservatives, but I think that to me, okay, that's where the federal government can step in to try to go, okay, we're going to help you shore this up till we can get this figured out. There should be a certain kind of, I think there should be something tied into that as well, because you do want to make sure that even if there is an economic meltdown, that, people can still get their health care, but I like that she's very pro doing something of that nature, but also the government not completely taking everything over either. And Europeans have some good ideas, but their system doesn't work here because we don't have that style of government. Like you can't put a European system in America because we don't work like that fundamentally.
Well, but we were talking about this too. Most European countries are the size of a state, if that.
Hmm.
And so it would, they do, but you can also talk to people. Canada has nationalized health care, and a lot of Canadians come here to get specialized services, and there are a lot of delays, and there are a lot of problems in some of those systems as well. I have a friend who lives in Costa Rica, and she's a permanent resident there. She's an American citizen, and she qualifies for their public health insurance, but she also buys private because, for the same reason, getting access to care is challenging, and sometimes the public health insurance won't pay for what her doctor says she needs. So, and again, I think all of these, again, I think these, you don't have, like nationalized European Union healthcare. You have each country having its own. And, it might be that your healthcare isn't as good in some of the European Union countries as they are in others. And that might be the case in the States here as well. But I think it makes a lot of sense to return, like so many of the things that have been federalized that have caused us to stray so far from the vision of our founders in terms of having really almost like we have independent countries in each state with a federal government that sits over us and makes sure we're fair to each other. And that's what the interstate commerce power was. And that we are protected through a strong military by putting those resources together. And then most everything else back to the state level. I think a lot of things would get adjusted if that were the case. Some states, it might not be as great to live in because of it, but I also believe that, for me, freedom is one of the most important things. We are so regulated from the federal level. I am not sure people who were born in the last 30 years have a sense of what freedom actually means, because every decision we make is so the government is in our business about everything, and we're either applying for permission or paying for permission to do almost everything that we do. Again, I think that gets us so far from the vision of our founders, and I'd like to see us as a country return back to that with state, local, and we the people control over our daily lives.
Yeah, no, especially, free speech and kinda how that really to me, I mean, it does tie into the budget process, right? I know Justin Amash, I'm sure you've heard of him. He was the only member of Congress to ever he was literally was the only ever libertarian member of Congress, right? Because he converted. And now he's kind of already jumped back over to the Republican side because that's a whole nother story. He's from Michigan. So, I guess I maybe just notice him a little bit more than others. He talked about how part of the problem in Washington is, and this kind of goes with free speech because it stifles the House of Representatives being able to bring things that they want, like individual reps, is things essentially don't get brought to the floor anymore or even to a lot of committees without the House Speaker's permission. And so the House Speaker literally, it's went from like they have always had that, but it's literally went to they are now the king or queen, depending who's in there, of the house, and they determine almost everything. And it's like there's very little that the minority party can do, and things of that nature. And he said that's why, part of the reason why over the last 15 years, he said why our government's become so unable to do things is now you've got one person who, just like the rest of them, get campaign donations, now controlling the flow and the process of everything. While they can't directly say your bill's not allowed, they can throw roadblocks in there to where it never even sees the light of day beyond your desk.
Yeah, and I think so there's a couple of things. There are what are known as discharge petitions, and that is one way to try to get around that. But I think this goes back to, the parties becoming so powerful and really that party apparatus. And the speaker and then whoever is in charge of the chairman of or chairwoman of the rules committee, because even if you get your bill introduced, okay, you're going to have to get a rule on how it gets debated, how it gets amended, how it's going to proceed. And so that also will influence. So if you can get it past the speaker, sometimes the speaker will let you get it past the speaker, but then it kind of dies in the rules committee, or they won't pass a rule that would allow you to debate it. And the individual members really don't have a lot of power. And I think that is really true. And it goes back to, the speaker does also have a lot of tools at his or her disposal to kind of keep you in line. One of those is committee assignments, and one of those is the tremendous amount of money that they can either help you with for your next election or hurt you with for your next election, and whether or not you might face a primary challenge and whether or not they might be supporting you. And, in the House, that power is amplified by the fact that you're having to run for election every 2 years, and I may have mentioned this last time. I'm not sure that I did, but you are essentially expected to start raising money, not just for your own reelection, but the party as well, immediately upon being sworn in as a member of the House. So you don't get a lot of time to be a free thinker when you're already hitting your call sheet of all the people you're trying to raise funds from. And I will admit that sometimes when we were lobbying and we were in DC, it was simply about the party. Who is this person going to vote for speaker? Because that will control the entire agenda. So I might disagree with 90% of the things you say, but you're going to vote for the Democratic speaker. So we're going to support you. And that 10% might be really important to me, or my client as a lobbyist. But it is 100% true that we would say, well, who are they voting for leadership is going to matter the most over who they are as an individual and their positions, because whoever is leader controls what bills they get to talk about, what amendments they get to introduce, and what committees are even gonna look at. So I think Justin Amash, he's right about that. And it gets back to another topic that I raised, I think, at the very end of our conversation, is we need new political parties. We have a lot of people here in the middle, who are disaffected from both.
40%, over 40% now.
And those are the ones just that they have captured. I think probably in the last 6 months, there have been a lot of people who left the Democratic Party fed up, just with a number of things. And, I think there's a big difference between MAGA and the Republicans. And I think some people are
Yes.
unhappy with both of them and unhappy. So I wouldn't, it wouldn't surprise me if we see even more people who are kind of saying, I don't really fit in the Republican box. I don't really fit in the Democrat box. So where do I fit? And how can we get people or parties and politicians to be responsive to where we, the people, actually are? And our founders were very clear, and I looked this up after we mentioned this last time we talked, but they were very, they warned us a lot about how political parties and factions could destroy our republic. And if we didn't have people in power who were attempting to do the very opposite of that, our republic could be in serious danger. And I think that's kind of where we find ourselves right now, is that on the one hand, we're so divided and tribal about it with our leaders. And then we have a huge amount of the population who doesn't feel that they have any say, doesn't feel that they have any ability to influence the way the country is going. And in the long term, that is not a prescription for a strong republic. So
No, it's not. I mean, it's especially when it comes to Republican. Oh, they call them rhinos now. If you're not MAGA, a lot of the times they call them rhinos, and I'm like, as much as MAGA doesn't want to, they do need rhinos to get things done, because MAGA does not hold every single seat. They got to that part is where I differ with the president, where I'm like, I get where the president wants to do certain things, and certain things I do agree with, but I'm like, you also got to recognize that some of the agenda of the rhinos is going to have to come to the table with you, because without them, you don't stand a chance. I mean, you're just going to be talking into the microphone. And I'm not saying that he's got to cave into who he is or his principles, you know what I mean? But if they say, hey, we want our small dog bone, but let's say that you want to do $1 trillion in cuts, right? But they come back and say, we can do 600 billion. Well, it's not the $1 trillion you want. You at least got the 600 billion, and now you can start going from there. And where I think that the MAGA could really work with Republicans on, and this is where I've become a very critical of the Libertarian Party, the more I've really kind of gotten into it. And just not gotten into it, but really I like their ideals, but is people need to know more than what your end game is. They need to know how you're going to get them from where they're at to where they're going to be without pulling the rug out from underneath them. And I feel like that's where MAGA is kind of struggling right now to a degree. Like maybe like you're talking Major Taylor Greene, like, hey, where's our plan, right? We know you want to get rid of Obamacare. Thumbs up. Anybody who has to pay insurance premiums probably agrees with you when they take their politics out of it. But what do you What's your plan? I need to know more than you just defunding it, because if you defund it without any plan, well, now my rates are going to triple and double. What's your plan to address these issues? What does that look like to the American people? That's where I like, because Trump's a very smart man. A lot of his people that he has around him are very smart. But that's like the one thing that they seem to like, I want to say like lack, right? But they're seeming to struggle in certain areas with that. And where he was a lot more like when it comes to tariffs, he's very clear, very clear. Like, it's pretty detailed about what he's going to do, what he wants to do. But when it comes to healthcare, it's everything's so vague. Like, it's got to be more than just saying, I want to get rid of it. That's great. We all want to get rid of a lot of things.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you there, Joe. I think it's really, really complicated. I do think we didn't really have a big conversation about how do we go from where we were with healthcare to Obamacare without creating a lot of challenges. And in fact, there were things that seemed to be pretty much lies. You can keep your doctor, for example. Should people be allowed to have catastrophic healthcare plans where, let's say, I'm really healthy and I don't really go to the doctor, but I want to make sure if I have a traumatic accident or I have cancer that I'm covered? Should I be able to buy that? And should the prices reflect that? And we didn't really have that conversation. And so a lot of people ended up not being able to get that kind of a plan. And we ended up with a lot of people losing networks, losing doctors that they liked. And so, I think sometimes it's hard to figure out how do we go from where we are to the end state we want to be without it hurting people in the meantime. And I think if we're having honest and truthful conversations, we need to talk about that. And we also need to talk about how do we minimize that. But we also need to be willing to accept a little pain in the short term to regain our freedom. Freedom is
Mhm.
often messy. Freedom is, and getting from a point where we're living in practically a nanny state, where, like I said, after I left DC and was not a lobbyist, I'm now a farmer and I bought land out in the country. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be able to do what I want with my land. Well, I actually can't. I actually have to get a permit for almost everything I do. I have to pay a tax. I have to get pay for a study. I have to do all these things. How do we get back to where that doesn't happen? There may be some pain involved, and it's a fair conversation. How much pain are we willing to accept and what kind of pain and how do we minimize it? But we have to talk about what those plans are. Some of the things, are vague that President Trump talks about. For example, transparency in pricing.
Yes.
I should be able to call up 4 different doctor's offices and say, "What does this cost?" And they should be able to tell me. And it shouldn't cost me the most if I have no insurance. Like, it shouldn't be a different price, and I should be able to shop around. Now, you can't always do that. And, saying to someone, "You know what? I'm diagnosing you with cancer." And the next thing that you're going to have to do is go comparison pricing doesn't really sound like a humane way to approach it. But it's changing the culture, right, around healthcare, which I actually call our healthcare system our sick care system, because we don't work hard enough to keep people healthy. We look at symptoms, we treat them. And quite frankly, if we were all healthy, our healthcare system, our sick care system would go bankrupt because they make money off of us being sick. And there's a perverse incentive in that because it doesn't make sense to keep people healthy in that regard. But that's a whole other topic we could talk about for a long time. But my point being that we have to have some difficult conversations in order to make these changes. And we have to be realistic about the fact that we have led our country to a really bad point in many ways, and getting back to a place that it makes sense, that people are free, and that we restore some of our state rights and local rights. There's going to be some pain involved in doing that. But avoiding the conversation about that pain just leaves us stuck in a situation where, we have all these medical bankruptcies. People can't afford their prescriptions. They can't afford the treatment that they want to get. And we don't help anybody by avoiding those tough conversations.
No, we don't. Not at all. I mean, we only hurt each other when it boils down to it. Um, you know, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it, like kind of like using that to um kind of, if you want to call it, like launch into talking a little bit more about Project 2029, right? And this is kind of where for me, like it was great that we wanted to talk about the shutdown because it almost kind of relates to it because 2025 relates to it too, from the right side, if you want to call it. Like one of the things that Project 2029 talks about is, the extreme tax on the wealthy to, help ensure fair pays for all workers, prevent, this and that. And, the whole, the progressive tax on extreme wealth to be, it in full disclosure for me anyways, Eisenhower was, he, really pushed forward a progressive tax system and it worked out with how he had it structured, but we were also a manufacturing economy back then. So it was a little bit different. But where I think people really need to know, especially when it comes down to the government and taxes, is the biggest issue isn't necessarily how much people are making right now. I mean, when you just look at it from a raw perspective, it is. But they don't realize that the massive debt that our government keeps incurring is what's killing the value of their money and driving a lot of the inflation. So if you start fixing the value because we use a fiat currency, if you start fixing that problem, now all of a sudden that $5 you have is going to be able to start getting you further. And then as things balance out, as you get raises, inflation will maybe not necessarily outpace you as much, but it's going to increase your buying power. What always made it easier for us to buy from China to make our lives quote unquote better, right? Cheaper goods is that our buying power was still strong. Where we're hurting now is yes, China's still cheap, but our money's devaluing. So which makes it very difficult to do things. And and I really wish that is because when you kind of talk about it like that, at least with the, you hear a lot of politicians when they do talk about it, people go, oh, well, you want to make everybody poor and cut poor people off from aid. And it's like, I'm literally not saying anything like that. But to me, that's like, and I think that's where Project 2029 gets it wrong significantly. And actually, I mean, to be fair, I mean, both parties really. Like, one of the big things that Project 2029 talked about is, they want to limit corporate influence on politics and they want to provide universal access to democracy. Like, from your perspective, what in God's name could you, I mean, because they don't really provide specifics on it, and maybe,
Yeah.
from what is universal access to I mean, I
Well,
guess I just don't
basically,
understand that.
it is their idea that in some way, our current policies prevent people from voting who should be able to vote, and I don't agree with that. I do think that I think that there you need to say there are two things that are really important for people to have faith in our electoral system. And the first one is that people who are eligible to vote can vote. Okay, that's the first one. But the second one is that there's integrity, that we can, make sure that everybody who is entitled to vote gets to vote, but only people who are entitled to vote gets to vote, and that all votes that are legal and eligible are counted and reported accurately. And they believe that there are a number of things that prevent people who should be able to vote from voting. One of those things are state voter ID laws, and they're on the wrong side on this one. The American public overwhelmingly supports voter ID. I actually talk about this in my book, Deprogramming Democrats, quite a bit. That, you need an ID to do just about anything. You can't rent a car. You can't rent a hotel room. You can't get an apartment. You can't buy liquor. You can't go to a health appointment. You can't do anything without an ID. But now, the most fundamental thing that affects the outcome of our country and the future for our children, you can't require an ID for. And, I used to kind of believe that if you were a really old person who maybe was born in the country, you wouldn't have access to some of the documents that might be necessary to prove citizenship and prove to get an ID. But I don't think that holds any water. And the fact that it's sort of held up as a racist policy to require an ID, I think is
That's
extremely derogatory to Black people and people of color. They can get an ID for all of the other things they need an ID for. And so I think the very first thing is that, let's require voter ID nationwide. And I think that they're talking about like polling places being closed and all sorts of things around access, but they really don't focus on integrity. I think most Americans would support a national holiday so people could vote. I think that might still, you might need a couple of days, because some people who work in retail, for example, their national holidays, they don't close, they're actually open. So you want to provide everyone with that opportunity to vote. And I agree with that. If you are eligible to vote, I think if you can't figure out how to make it somewhere to vote, it's not just a right, it's also, in my opinion, a responsibility. You are looking at your views, and your vote will help determine the future of this country. And so figuring out how to get to the polling place, I think if you have a significant disability, if you're uh, member of our military and stationed overseas, maybe you should have access to a mail-in ballot. I don't think that mail-in ballots should be used in any other way, for people. I think and you can look at, I can't remember the study, but it was a nonpartisan study that came out maybe sometime around 2012 or 2013. And it basically said that mail-in balloting is the biggest threat to election integrity. It's the easiest way to commit
Yes.
fraud, and the hardest to verify. So I don't think we should rely on that. And I also think we ought to look at the role of technology. I don't trust voting machines. I don't trust the software. You could go in 2019 and you'd see a ton of Democrats talking about how easy it is to reprogram these machines.
Yes.
And then
Because
all of a sudden,
they tried to do the same thing Trump did in 2020, but they tried to do it in 2016. Not to the
right, with
degree that he
Russia.
did, but they tried the same thing. Yeah.
And so I
Everybody
think,
conveniently forgot about that.
yeah, it was the most secure election ever in 2020. And now, while I can't sit here and say I can prove to you, although Tulsi Gabbard has said that there is some there in what happened in 2020, meaning that there is evidence of potential fraud. I just think getting that the voting machines out of our process would make a lot of sense. And getting back to, here's a paper ballot and, mark your choice here and those kind of things. So, but to completely ignore the election integrity side and only talk about access, I think harkens back to a time when there was actual voter suppression, when there was racism that prevented, Black people in the South from voting. We don't live in that time anymore. And we need to focus on, in my opinion, ensuring that everybody who's eligible to vote can cast a vote, and that all of the eligible ballots get counted and accurately counted and reported. I also think something that might make a lot of sense is that, and this would be up to the states, but I don't think any state should report any totals until they're done counting.
Yeah. I mean, that's I I I I don't disagree with that necessarily. Not one bit. How would you feel about, I don't know how we would do it on national, but how would you feel about ranked choice voting? Because there's some states that have it. And I mean, for the most part, from everything I've seen, I haven't gone into super detail about it, but from everything I've seen, there really hasn't been too many downsides to it in the areas that are doing it. But obviously, it's isolated areas, so it's not, you don't have that broader test yet. But what are I mean, obviously from like a legal perspective.
I think the devil's in the details about how it works and those kind of things. I think I'd have to think about it a little bit more, to be honest, Joe, and I can you know get back to you about that. But I do also, it's sort of on a different thing, but I do also want to raise the elimination of the electoral college that they talk about in Project 2029. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the purpose of the electoral college. And I think that it gets back to, again, this lack of the foundation of what our founders wanted for our system, and that is federalism, and that is states' rights. And the idea there is to protect small states from tyranny of the majority by the big states. And I think I mentioned this, we were talking about it earlier, but California has enough votes that they could swing the outcome of a lot of elections if it were a pure how many people voted. Well, a state like Wyoming would just get run over all the time. And the idea of our founders was these states are going to be the primary governing institution for the people who live in each state. And therefore, each state gets equal part through the Electoral College. And it's to protect the rights of small states from being run over by big states. And so it is true that it is not a pure democratic institution, the Electoral College. That's because we are not a pure democracy, and that is because our founders feared the tyranny of the majority as much as they feared the tyranny of the minority, and put in these checks and balances, and in the case of the Electoral College, to protect small states from a few big states. I mean, even if it's not just California, if you said California and New York, those two together could probably determine every election. Although California, a lot of people are leaving and moving to places like Texas and Florida, but that's a whole other thing. But and then New York is hemorrhaging people as well. But I think it's important to remember that. And I wholeheartedly oppose the elimination of the Electoral College
Yeah, no,
for
I
that
mean,
reason.
it's important, and I guess I think people just don't understand it because in their mind they hear the word democracy, right? And where that comes in is that's again another, and I'm not calling teachers failures, right? But another failure of our, if you want to call it upbringing, our education, or our understanding of our own education. Because I don't want to say because I'm not in schools these days, so I don't know what they're telling them. But like my son, he's 15 going on 16. I don't think he would have a very big understanding of the Electoral College if I wasn't talking to him about it, because it's just not something that they talk about it to a basic degree, but they don't really teach them about it. And I think that that's part of where our issues are. When it comes to that, is there's a lack of it, and then when you do have certain institutions educating on it, a good chance is a lot of them are going to be biased, or the teacher's not going to be able to take away their bias and give them just the raw education on it. And sometimes that's just natural because they're human beings, but I think that they need to really focus on that. And I think if people do that and they understand like how the government works, like they don't need to be as super detailed as everybody, right? But they got to have more of an understanding of the process. Things are more than just what the result is going to be. The process matters almost more than the end result, because that process is what's going to establish what that result does down the road.
Well, it does, and it also establishes whether people have faith in the institutions that run our country and in way too many cases run our lives. And I will say that I do think that our education system has failed on civics education, and I think that a lot of legal immigrants who pass a citizenship test know more about our country's governance and founding than a lot of our kids who come up through our school system. I don't think, though, it's by happenstance, Joe, and I don't think that it is just an individual teacher's failing. I think that our higher education institutions have been taken over by radical professors, for the most part, who don't support the American experiment and don't believe, and many of them believe in communism. Many of them believe in socialism, which in practical experience usually ends up in a communist takeover of a proposed socialist revolution. And that these are the people who are educating our teachers. And then our
Yes.
teachers go into the schools. And I was having another conversation on another podcast, and someone was saying that his son at their school they're going to put Columbus on trial for genocide as part of a school
Good
project.
Lord.
Yeah, and so he said to his son, "Well, you are going to be on the defense team. You are going to defend Christopher Columbus." But this is the kind of thing where we're talking about you're on stolen land. Your America is not a force for good. There isn't, the American exceptionalism. There isn't the belief in the Constitution. And these are the people who are teaching the children. And I will admit as well, like, I'm not in the schools, but I hear stories like this all the time where, you don't see American flags in classrooms anymore, but you do see pride flags and BLM flags. You don't see, I 100% support freedom of religion, but you don't see the 10 Commandments ever. And while I'm not saying everyone should follow the 10 commandments. What I am saying is, should we be teaching them and so people can think about them and those kind of things? But what gets into the classroom has a huge impact on how our children come out of school. And so these things I don't think are by happenstance. I think they are a result of the radicalization of our institutions of higher learning, with over 90% of professors being Democrats and 95% of them, of their donations going to Democratic politicians, and many of them believing in, critical theory and deconstruction, and with the end result to destroy the American institutions and replace them with a communist infrastructure. And so I think um, it is important. It's really important that parents, I was like very heartened to hear that you're having these conversations with your son, um, because, I have had the opportunity to speak to young people who, I asked them, do you know what the First Amendment is? And some of them can answer a little bit, but most of them don't know. And none of them practically know what the Fourth Amendment is, because that's been so gutted in their lifetime. Ever since the Patriot Act, the Fourth Amendment hardly ceases to exist. And
And for
so,
clarity
with
to everybody is Trump did reauthorize that his first term.
once you give government power, they hardly ever take it away. And that particular one, probably, if he wouldn't have signed it, they would have probably overridden his veto. Both sides of the aisle love that power. And I think so. The Patriot Act, I actually was so mad when it passed, and so mad at the Democrats, because at the time, I actually hadn't gone to law school yet when the Patriot Act passed, but I had really followed the erosion of our Fourth Amendment rights that occurred through the drug war. And just in case anyone isn't who's listening, the Fourth Amendment is your protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and your protection, your ability to be secure in your papers, your persons, and your home, and no searches should occur without a warrant. Well, they started chipping away at the warrant requirement through the war on drugs. And as that was happening, I saw the writing on the wall as they were slowly chipping away. Well, if the police officer believed he had, good faith, then maybe it's okay if he searches you without a warrant. Well, our founders were really clear. No, no, no searches without a warrant. It doesn't matter if he thought he could search you without a warrant, kind of thing. And then once the Patriot Act, and then once the Transportation Security Act, which created TSA, passed, our Fourth Amendment rights completely disappeared. And in an age of technology, as Edward Snowden pointed out, that what he risks to bring to us, we really don't have any Fourth Amendment rights of privacy to our information and our data at all. And so I think it's much easier to get younger people to accept more and more infringement on these basic rights when they don't even understand what they are, and then add to it, in their lifetime, they haven't seen them in operation. And so, I think I I actually encourage a lot of parents, if you can do it, to homeschool, especially if your children are young right now. And I understand the economic reality of most families, and I don't think either party is doing a very good job giving us solutions for that economic reality that most Americans face. But if you can homeschool your kids, I highly encourage it. And if your kids have any interest at all in learning a trade, I highly encourage that too, instead of going to college, unless they really know what they want to do with that college degree, and do a lot of research about what the future of that field is in 10 years, especially in light of AI and the AI impact on information space jobs and things like that. So,
Yeah, I
so
mean,
um,
and you're right. People don't necessarily always understand that part of it, which they should, but they don't. It's that part is definitely, I don't know if you want to call it a shame, but it is a shame. A lot of people don't understand it.
you're talking
And the
about
Fourth
the
Amendment, you're right. The Fourth Amendment, yeah. I mean that it's. I mean it has been gutted. They'll try to plead ignorant. Certain people will try to plead ignorance, and then the cop or the judge or whoever, oh, whoa, whoops, oops. If you have a clue of what you're doing or know how it's supposed to work, you can get out of it. But they're going to try to play you for dumb in a lot of cases. Not all. And I'm not knocking police or judges, but there's some folks out there that try to be slick about it. The internet has exposed that. I mean, that's not my personal opinion. That's just literally what's out there. And I think that saying I don't authorize my car to be searched is grounds for call your supervisor for a possible suspicion because you're not letting me in your car. Well, all that is just changing the way you get in my car. That means that my Fourth Amendment really doesn't matter. You can just, you can shred it up whenever, you feel like it. That's
Yeah.
that's how I feel about that one.
No, I agree. And, I think you might hear some people say, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. And that is a very, in my opinion, totalitarian way to think. The government should be out of
Yes.
my business unless they have probable cause to believe that I have done something wrong. And they've turned that around on its head. And I think, if we continue down this road, our First Amendment rights and our Second Amendment rights are really the only things that are keeping us from going to a space where everything we do is the government's business. And I don't want to live in that society. I want to live in a society where the presumption of innocence still exists and the presumption that the government has a very high bar to meet in terms of a probable cause determination by a judge to explore my records, my phone records, my banking records, my emails, my text messages. And, it's hard to think of how we get back to that, especially when, as a recovering attorney, as I like to call myself, I don't even read all of the, what do you call it? All of the, like, terms of acceptance when you download an app.
Right.
Generally, you're giving your rights away when you accept the app, but that's the choice that we have now. You either don't use that app or you say they can cooperate with, law enforcement if needed or things like that. So we're being pushed
And I
into a
believe that
corner.
if I'm right with that, didn't a lot of that really kind of start like getting a strong foothold about addressing that when I believe was it Epstein or Snowden when they were trying to get into their Apple device, I believe it was an iPhone to get records, and then that's kind of what really ignited it and started changing all that to give like more of a broad, hey, we're going to do this. Because before that, I believe Apple was very reluctant to let the government look at anything in their systems.
Yeah, they were, and I think that has changed. And then I think we've seen, I'm trying to remember, I think that the FBI admitted to even looking at our senators' phones during one of the anti-Trump operations, and I can't remember which one, but because there have been a number of them, but basically, yeah, we're at a point where I don't think that they are. I don't think most people have any expectation of privacy anymore, and I don't think that's good. I think that it's been an interesting thing to watch as someone who grew up completely without technology. When social media first hit, I couldn't understand it. I could not understand why people wanted to know. They wanted everybody to know where they were at all times, what they had for dinner, what they were up to. Complete lack of a private life. And now I see that it has really resulted in the willingness to allow government into every aspect of your life. And I remember when what people chose to do in the bedroom was kept pretty much in the bedroom and not part of a display to everyone about their personal life like that. And it's just a really
Yes.
weird trajectory that we're on. And I just don't know where we end up with this, Joe, where, that is good in terms of people having some right to privacy, right to just tell the government and their neighbors, what I'm doing is none of your business. I'm not hurting anybody. You don't have any reason to believe I am, so stay out of my business.
No, I agree 1,000%. And I think anybody who has a lick of common sense, would be wanting to try to do that. I mean, the Jimmy, summarizing all that up, I mean, I think the Jimmy Kimmel thing is I understand, why everybody wanted him off the air. Not arguing it. His popularity has been going away for a long time. All that's acceptable. But and I'm not excusing anything he's done in the past, the pro censorship stuff that he's done. And I think if he would have waited a month or two, maybe three to kind of say things maybe in the manner that he did, probably wouldn't have went the way it went, right? But he did it when it was still raw in people's minds. everybody was still upset about it, because I don't think that if you don't like Charlie Kirk or not even opening to hear what he has to say, you're automatically like just it's bad, good riddance, and the worst part is outside of like things like abortion that if a lot of Democrats should just step back and look at the principle of what Charlie Kirk is trying to say, it's very aligned outside of DEI, it's very aligned with their basic principles as well. Freedom of choice, freedom to, it's just certain things shouldn't be imposed on kids. Certain things isn't the government's responsibility, but you have the freedom to do it, and I mean, that's a little bit more of a centrist approach than people on the left want to take. But, some of those basic freedoms that they talk about, he's for, but they don't want to hear it because the media tells them he's just, well, mainstream, I should say, he's a bad guy. He's the boogeyman.
And his ideas, as you say, they weren't particularly far right wing. I think, and I think here's the thing: the First Amendment says the government shall pass no law infringing on the freedom of speech. In today's environment, I will take law to mean regulations and two, because our founders didn't envision an administrative state where an agency made all these regulations. They only envisioned Congress and then the executive branch, and it grew out of control. My point here is that I want to make to people is that your freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want to say, and the government shouldn't put anything in place to stop you from saying it. It doesn't say that you are protected from the consequences of what you say, right? So if your employer didn't like what you said and thinks it reflects badly on their business, they should be free to fire you for that. If the network didn't like what Jimmy Kimmel had to say, they should be able to fire him for what he said. I
Yes.
don't think the FCC commissioner, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, should have said what he said. I
Right. It
will
gives the
point out
appearance.
that one FCC commissioner who may have been appointed but does not work directly for Trump, shouldn't be looked at as this is what the Trump administration said, because President Trump didn't say it. Carolyn Levitt didn't say it. So, but my point is that free speech does not mean you are free from the consequences of that speech. It does mean that the government shouldn't impose consequences on you because of that speech, unless it falls into a very, very narrow category of speech, which is the immediate incitement to violence. Okay, that's what the Supreme Court has said. The example they often use is you can't walk into a crowded theater and yell fire when there's no
Fair
fire,
enough.
because it's very likely that people will get hurt by trying to run out of the theater. But, in my opinion, that also means that the federal government should not be regulating hate speech.
No, I agree. They shouldn't be. I mean, it's no, if you're advocating killing someone based on color, okay, well, now we got a problem, but just saying, if, not that I'm like okay with it, but if you're just saying, well, I don't like somebody because they're white, well, that's protected. You know what I mean? Now, if I'm going around saying kill all white people or kill all black people, that I think that's kind of where, because to me, that's not freedom of speech. You're advocating, violence, and when somebody, obviously I'm sure there's like, a lot more rigmarole to that than I know of. But, I guess that's kind of where I get it, because it's look at the Nazi comments about Charlie Kirk and all them, right? And I want to say incentivized, it encouraged certain people. The vast majority of Democrats I know would never shoot someone for their opinion. Even if they think that person's Nazi views, they generally would never pick up a gun to kill you. So I'm not saying all Democrats, but like, the people who either A got some kind of mental issue, which some of these people that have done these things appear to do, no matter who it is, but saying things like that, like almost incentivizes, encourages them to do these violent acts.
People should be judicious with their words. I think that there is a great incentive in today's soundbite 24-hour news cycle environment to say something that gets a lot of clicks. And I think people should be reflect a little bit more on some of the things they say. I think that calling someone a Nazi who is not a Nazi is pretty abhorrent, to be honest. And
Yeah.
it's designed to create fear, to create anger, to create an emotional environment in which rational thinking goes out the window. And I think I think we may have talked about this on the first time that we chatted, Joe, but I believe that we are facing a really severe mental health crisis in our country. And I think that a lot of people lack the ability to regulate their emotions. They're disconnected. A lot of this language is used to create an other that we dehumanize the people who are not like us. And it creates an environment in which violence of that kind is more likely and less likely to be viewed as unacceptable in certain populations who have some mental challenges and also may be on some pretty strong pharmaceuticals that may encourage homicidal ideation. And I know, I'm really happy to hear that Secretary Kennedy is looking into, what the potential role of SSRIs and some of these other pretty strong drugs that we have some of our youth on. And because if they do have suicidal and homicidal ideation as listed side effects on the black box warning on these drugs. Well, we're
Yes.
putting so many people on these drugs, and we're not really looking at what is causing this level of anxiety, this level of depression, this level of inability to cope with modern life in our young people. This disconnection, this lack of community, so in my opinion, anybody who pulls out a gun and shoots someone else has a mental illness. Unless you're
Yes.
defending your own life. There is something mentally that is going on with you that has caused you to believe that that is an acceptable way to behave, and in some cases, it's that you're in a culture and in an environment where that's the norm, but in most cases, it is something else is going on with you mentally that we as a society are not dealing with. We as a society are not creating an environment in which you can get help. We can help address what is underlying that belief for you. And the rhetoric of calling people names without thinking about
Oh my
what
gosh.
the
I know.
impact of that is, I don't agree with that at all. Again, if you say someone is Hitler, or you say someone is a Nazi or a fascist, or that, is going to destroy our democracy, or, um, is trying to be a king, you are encouraging potentially mentally unwell people to take action as a result.
Yes.
The other thing is that one of the biggest, well, there are a few steps to indoctrinating someone or brainwashing them, but repetition is one of those steps. And so if you hear every politician that you trust, every news source that you trust, everyone in your social media bubble that you trust over and over saying threat to democracy, fascist, Nazi, that is going to become your belief. And if people aren't denouncing it, you're going to end up with some actions that are tragic, like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, some of these other shootings, recently that we've had that are supposedly in response to a quote unquote trans genocide in this country. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice by not having open conversations about this and really looking at what can we do to address these mental health challenges that young people in this country are facing, and what can we do to help parents who identify some things going on with their children to make different choices to help support their children without tragic results like we've seen.
No, for sure. I feel like I mean, God, we could do like 9,000 episodes on all this. It's definitely, we're going to have to keep like expanding on this. Like, it's almost got to be like a series. um, you know, it's definitely like the balance with a lot of this that has to come from the government, and you want to call it both sides, but I think it just really needs to be the American people putting the pressure on the government for me. That's kind of where I go to with it. And it's just it's the financial responsibility where I feel like that's kind of gotten lost. The fiscal realism, the transparency, like you talk a lot about, especially about the transparency, and we need a government that's both competent and also has compassion to a small degree, but some compassion for its own citizens, right? And not for citizens of a certain party. Whether no matter what your party is, certain things should be off limits for the government to really to mess with. And sometimes certain things, especially with free speech, we've seen under Joe Biden, um, what happened with COVID and social media. They denied it. And then as soon as Trump got elected, all of a sudden, oh, yeah, we were doing it. They all came out and admitted, yeah, we were silencing everybody. Now people on the left are like, oh, well, you didn't like it, but now you're doing it. And it's like, all right, guys, like, let's be real here. Like, the problem is that any of you are accepting of it in any situation on these things. Like, that's the problem. It shouldn't be, well, I did it, so no, like it's let's say it's not acceptable no matter what. I did an episode the other day, a self episode monologue where I said, we in order to find a middle area to move forward, we have to hold our own side slash party slash constituent accountable. That's where it starts. Not as much as, hey, da, da, but we got to be able to look and be like, yeah, I voted for Obama, but I didn't like ABC. Like, we got to be able to say that without retribution from your own side, like chasing you out the door. You like how they're treating John Fetterman, right? There's a lot of Democrats that now want to run him out of town. They want to primary him out. And it's like, why? Because he says that people shouldn't suffer while you guys figure your lives out. Like that makes no sense to me why that's a problem, because to me both parties should want that. They should want some kind of common sense approach, but it just seems to be lost.
Well, I think it gets
It's
lost
terrible.
in the shuffle of billions of dollars, and it gets lost
Oh my gosh, I know.
in the like I said, it's just we've gotten to the point where it is, especially among people who are very immersed in politics, it's very tribal, it's very factioned, it's very and I would say this happens on the right too, but again, as I mentioned the first time, I speak mostly from experience on the left because that's where I came from. But the minute you start by from a premise that it is a moral failing to be someone on the other side, you're not open to the possibility that your own side is wrong because you believe the other side is immoral. And I think that uh, once you get there, it's very hard to hold your own side accountable. And I 100% agree with you that we really do need to be open to the possibility that, questioning ourselves, questioning our own opinions. I also think that what has happened a lot on the left, and again, this one I think everyone's subject to from sometimes, but they've lost sight of principles. They don't start from a principle and then say, this is my principle. Freedom of speech is absolute. And so I'm not going to censor speech now because I don't want my own speech censored. And they often come from a place of the ends justify the means. So as long as I'm safe, we'll do whatever I have to do to get there. Or as long as, my right to choose is protected, I don't care what happens in the meantime. And so I would urge everyone to really take a step back, no matter what side you think you're on, or you're in the middle, or you don't have a home, to think about what your foundational principles are. What are your principles that your policy ideas and your desire for government action come from? And then evaluate everything that your party is saying in light of those principles. And then imagine that the person in power is someone you hate, someone whose ideas you hate. And do you want them to have the power that you now are wanting the people on your side to have? And if you can, from your principles, go all the way there, then go for it. But I would almost guarantee you people on both sides can't get from their principles all the way through those questions. And a lot of times they would not be supporting the action that their side is taking. And I think on the left, the desire, and again, probably on the right too, but I don't fit into any of these boxes anymore, and my experience is on the left. But their willingness to just throw you over the cliff because you stray once from the party line, you stray once from the ideological conformity that they're asking for, makes it really challenging for people to stand up to their own party, like John Fetterman is, and say, I don't think you're right here. Because they are willing to throw you off over the cliff and primary you and take away your committee assignments and all these things because you did that. I think our republic needs us all, though, to be willing to take that risk and speak the truth and question ourselves and then question the people who we think we agree with, starting from our foundational principles.
No, I agree, 1,000%. I mean, it should be common sense for a lot of people, but it's not. You
I
know,
wish it were.
not
I wish it
necessarily
were.
their fault. It's just how they're, like your book says, deprogramming, right? They're programmed to think that way. And then once you're programmed to think that way, it's very, very hard to come away from that. But we had a really good episode today, Lisa. I love it. I appreciate you coming on. To be honest with you, right now, I don't know, because there's certain things that MAG is doing that are turning voters off that voted for them, but at the same time, those voters don't like the left either. It's because the left has kind of stayed on their true and tried thing that they did in 2024, which cost them everything. So it's kind of almost like I won't say like wait and see approach, right? But it's going to be interesting to see how this cycle really formulates.
I think that the left hasn't seemed to learn anything from 2024. In fact, they've doubled down on a lot of the things that have really cost them a lot of voters. And I would urge them to take a look at their principles and try to articulate what they stand for that isn't identity politics in a way that might appeal if they want to see some things change. It is very hard to see where we're gonna be a year from now when we're about to go back to the voting booths for the congressional and Senate midterms. And in many ways, as I used to say, a year is forever in politics because, especially with people's short attention spans, I don't know. I think how this government shutdown ends could have some impact. But then again, we're a year out. So people may not even remember this. And who knows what they're going to throw at us to try to influence those elections between now and then. So I agree. I think it's gonna be really interesting.
Yeah, no, I 1,000% agree with that. I appreciate you coming on, Lisa. Everybody, if you're tired of hearing noise, you definitely need to check out Lisa's book. The link will be in the comment section, not comment section, description. My apologies. Like hit the pause button on some of this partisan stuff and like check that out. You're going to get a lot of things where Lisa's going to, I want to say quote unquote expose, but she essentially exposes some of this stuff that Democrats hide. And, I mean, she speaks from the left, but, from that perspective, but it's things like that go on the right too. They just do it in a different fashion. Every week, we're seeing different things come out, like all these Project 20, they do, or your paycheck changes depending on the political win. Like we were talking about, the middle, believe it's 40% of Americans now, I believe right around that ballpark, maybe a little bit more, identify as independent. They don't hardcore lean one way or the other. And I think that's very telling. But the problem is you go to any news website, any news station, none of them will tell you that. They'll be like, oh, the American, but what they'll say is 50% Democrats, 50% Republicans. But what they're not telling you is that's like 20% of the population of the people they're talking about. They're not talking about the vast majority of Americans. They're talking about a small section. So I'm kind of against that. Everybody, go to the middlegroundmike.com, sign up for the newsletter, because staying informed isn't just activism anymore. It's essentially survival. A lot, don't forget to check out the segment section that's going to be on there now. And a lot of stuff from this interview is going to be on there, and it'll pack a lot in there. I can guarantee you that. Let's stop shouting at each other and start rebuilding the country, the middle, and living the promise that we've always wanted. And I thank everybody for tuning in. And Lisa, thank you for coming on. Again, everybody check her book out. It is vital for if you want to have some common ground and to be grounded in some common sense. Thank you for everybody for tuning in, and everybody have a good day.
Thank you, Joe.